So first of all, before I even start the video, I just want to say right away to clarify that the best, most surefire way to make sure that you're in a calorie deficit or in a calorie surplus if you're bulking is by just simply counting your calories. But that's not what you came here for. You want to know how you can do these things without counting calories. And so today I'm going to be showing you how I usually go about cutting or bulking without counting calories, having done it multiple times before in my life. But before I get into that, real quick, let me just introduce myself. My name is Alphonse. Here we talk about how to maximize results from your training with as little time in the gym and with as little risk of injuring yourself in the process as possible. But anyways, let's get into the video. So first off, I want to start up with another disclaimer, which is that I personally am a person who has a pretty easy time to lose fat. I don't have a very hard time to put on weight either, but generally I have a pretty easy time to lose fat when I want to. If you're someone who has a harder time to lose fat for whatever reason, then this approach might be a lot harder for you. I also want to mention that there is a lot of disadvantages to doing it this way without counting calories. It's not going to be nearly as reliable or as consistent most of the time as if you were just simply counting your calories. And it's also going to be harder to know that you are consistently in a calorie deficit, since the only sign that you will have showing you that you're either in a calorie deficit or in a surplus is which way the scale is moving, if it's going up or if it's going down. And as you start to get pretty lean, this approach is going to be even harder to utilize if you want to maximize the amount of fat that you lose while losing as little muscle mass as possible, or ideally no muscle mass. Because as you get leaner, you're of course going to have less fat on your body, and your body can only take about 30 calories per day per pound of fat that you have on your body. And so as you start to get leaner, you're going to have to use a smaller calorie deficit, and so that margin of error that you have when you're just going off intuition and not counting your calories is going to get smaller and smaller, and so it's going to get harder and harder the leaner you get if you're not counting your calories. But anyways, with that out of the way, let's get into the things that you want to think about if you are going to do a bulk or a cut without counting calories. The first thing that you're going to need to do is to track your protein. Yes, even though we're not counting calories with this approach, you're still going to have to do some tracking, and we want to track our protein. And it doesn't matter whether you're bulking or cutting, by the way, you still want to be tracking your protein. You want to try to hit about 1 gram per pound of body weight, assuming that you have, average body fat percentage, about, 12 to 15% body fat. If you are someone who is over fat, you have too much fat on your body, then you would need to calculate your lean body mass, and the way you would do that is by taking your total weight and then finding out your body fat percentage, and then calculating how many pounds of fat on your body you have, then taking your total body weight minus those pounds of fat that you have to get your lean body mass, and then you would multiply your lean body mass by 1.15 to find out how much you would weigh if you were 15% body fat, and then you would take that number times 1 to find out how many grams of protein you should be eating per day. Also, I forgot to mention that alternatively you could just calculate your lean body mass in pounds and then take that times 1.1 to find out how many grams of protein you should be eating per day. That might actually be a lot more simple for a lot of people. And you also, of course, would want to spread out your protein as evenly as possible between your different meals throughout the day. And while we're on the topic of macronutrients, when it comes to carbs and fat, don't completely remove or cut either of them too low. You can eat more or less of either one depending on your preferences. But when you are trying to lose weight, when you're trying to cut, the most important thing is that you're in a calorie deficit and that you are getting adequate protein plus strength training, so you're losing the least amount of muscle possible, ideally no muscle at all. The next thing that we want to be doing when we are bulking or cutting without counting calories is that we want to be tracking our weight. This is extremely important because this is the only reliable sign that we have, except for maybe how you look in the mirror, that shows us if we are in a calorie deficit or in a calorie surplus if we are trying to gain weight. If the scale isn't moving, you aren't losing or gaining any weight at all. If it's going up, then of course you're in a calorie surplus. And if it's going down, then of course you're in a calorie deficit. And whether that's good or bad depends on what you're trying to do. But it's also important to keep in mind that we don't want the scale to be moving too fast. If you're cutting, then you don't want to be losing more than about 1% of your body weight per week. And if you're bulking, if you're in a surplus, then it's pretty much up to you to decide how much fat you are comfortable with gaining relative to muscle. But keep in mind though that when you're bulking, you still don't want to be gaining more fat than you're gaining muscle. If that's happening, then your calorie surplus is too big. Now, since we're not counting calories, there are a couple of signs that I want to mention that can indicate that your calorie deficit, if you're cutting, is also too big. If you just feel generally tired, like general fatigue, and your sleep and stuff like this hasn't changed, or if you're regressing and getting weaker on lots of your movements in the gym, then your calorie deficit is likely too large. Now, I apologize for pausing the video so much, but I also have to add that when you are weighing yourself, it's very important that you do it under the same conditions and at the same time of day. So usually what's best is to do it first thing in the morning with either the same clothes or no clothes on, and after you have went to the toilet. So yeah, keep that in mind when you're weighing yourself. Now, the next thing that I want to talk about that I have kind of determined myself is that if you're going to cut or bulk without counting calories, in my experience, it's very important to have a pretty damn clean diet. Because if you're going to try to do an intuitive bulk or an intuitive cut or something like this without counting calories, if you're eating a bunch of highly processed foods and processed sugar and a bunch of junk like that, number one, it usually contains a lot of calories, and that can be a problem both if you're cutting and if you're bulking, because again, you don't want to be gaining more fat than you're gaining muscle, so you don't want to have a too big of a calorie surplus when you're bulking, and you also don't want to have a too big of a calorie deficit when you're cutting. And number two is that even though these foods usually contain a lot of calories, they don't contain a lot of nutrients, and so they're not going to make you very full. Plus, we know that things like processed sugar and stuff like this does mess up your satiety, and having foods that are messing up your satiety when you're just bulking or cutting off intuition and going off how you feel is not a good thing. And so in my experience with having done this multiple times before, it's very important to have a very clean diet if you're going to do this approach, because if you don't, it's just going to be a lot harder for the reasons that I discussed. Now, the next thing is, what things do you want to think about to make sure that you are in either a calorie surplus or a calorie deficit when you're doing this without counting calories? So first of all, I just want to say again that make sure that you are getting your protein in. When you're eating your meal, make sure that you have your protein on your plate there first. And since your protein intake is going to be pretty much the same whether you are bulking or cutting, the things that you are going to be reducing is going to be your carbs and your fats. And if you are bulking, the way that I've usually done it in the past is I just eat until I'm full, and then I eat a little bit more. And then if I'm cutting, I just eat a little bit less than I would like to, while still getting in my protein, of course. And again, the way that you then know what you are doing is working is by looking at the scale and seeing in which direction it's moving. If it's moving in the direction that you want and it's not going too fast, then you're doing a good job. If it's not, well, then you might need to raise or lower how much food you're eating or your calories that's going to be based on, what you're trying to do. Now, lastly, I want to mention that bulking and cutting without counting calories is also kind of like a skill that you get better at doing it over time as you do it more and more. Being someone that has done this a couple of times before in my life, I have gotten pretty good at gauging how much food I need to eat in order to gain or lose weight, whatever it is I'm trying to do. But if you're someone who's doing this method for the first time, then it's probably going to be a lot harder for you in the beginning. But anyways, guys, that's all for this video. I really hope you guys liked it. If you found this video even a little bit useful, if you felt like you learned anything from this video, then please don't forget to leave a like on this video. And if you want to see more videos like this in the future, also don't forget to click that subscribe and ring that notification bell so you can be notified the next time I upload. But with that being said, I'll see you guys in the next video next time. Peace.